sign into law an act making appropriations for the fiscal year 2023 to provide for supplementing certain existing appropriations and for certain other activities and projects. This act includes an extension until March 31st of 2025 of the remote meeting provisions. This August 6, 2024 meeting of the Long Range Financial Planning Committee is being conducted by a remote participation by the board. I hear that Laura has just begun recording this via Zoom, and I will grant permission to anyone else indicating they wish to record. Is there anyone who is wishing to record this? Seeing none, I'm gonna jump into, first of all, welcome back. I hope you all have been having a great summer. Laura, thank you and welcome. You will be the new administrative support for our committee going forward, so welcome aboard.
You.
Also would like to welcome Ellen Larkin-Rawlings, who is our planning board liaison, replacing Chris Paff, who after many years of service to the community did not run for re-election this year. So welcome, Ellen.
Thank you.
I'm going to hold my congratulations for Paula, right? Because she'll be joining in a moment. And I know at least a couple of you are celebrating recent high school graduations, which means only one thing: you have rapidly approaching excitement and angst for college departures. So appreciate you making the time for your service on this committee, and enjoy these life mile markers, as I know these are what's most important. And with that, we'll begin with a current roll call of the members. I'll start with Nancy Hyde.
Here.
Ellen Larkin-Rawlings.
Here.
Maya Plotkin. Phil Shapiro.
Here.
Paul Tesseri.
Here.
Julie Bride.
Here.
Nancy James.
Here.
Melissa McDonough, we know, is not on yet. Has Paula joined?
I'm here.
Excellent. Welcome, Paula, and congratulations on your latest grandchild.
Thank you. He's adorable. I do say so myself.
And then I know Skip Wells is not on. And then just for the ex officio members, Chris Coleman. I know he's there. He must be on mute.
Sorry, here. Thank you.
Okay. Molly Keene.
Here.
Stephanie McManus.
Here.
Pat Ahern.
Present.
Nora Loughnane.
Here.
Todd Korchin.
Here.
Lema Jean-Baptiste. Tim, do you know if she'll be joining?
I'm not sure, actually.
Okay. Tim Pivovar, who has just spoken up.
Here.
Elijah Romulus. And Jimmy McCarthy.
Here.
Okay. You got all of that, Laura, in terms of attendees? You're probably on mute as well.
Yep, we're all set.
All right. So it's been a minute since we were last together. If you remember, the last time we were together was at the end of January, when Nora Loughnane, our Director of Economic Development, gave us an overview of new growth. In that discussion, she covered the likely yield to incremental commercial tax revenue and highlighted some of the constraints that we face generating such new commercial tax growth. Laura circulated the minutes of that meeting in advance of this meeting, and we'll get to the business of approving those at the end of this meeting here. Now, we hadn't met since December because I promised you that I would respect your time and we would only meet when we have matters of substance to discuss. And thus it hasn't made sense to do, as we're waiting for the completion of the townwide facilities study. That's currently underway with Doran Whittier, and we expect to have the study complete for both the school and the municipal buildings this fall, which then will accordingly give us much meatier topics to discuss. However, at a recent select board meeting, Chairman Privatera asked that we, this committee, study the concept of a real estate transfer fee. And this is why we have reconvened the group. The purpose of today's meeting is to brief you all on the request and then hopefully divvy up some of the associated work that will take us into this sole agenda item. So as you know, through your participation in this group, we have a large number of capital-intensive projects on the horizon, as many aging buildings reach the end of their useful life and demand for town resources has increased. You also know that we have limitations such as Prop 2.5 and a very small percentage of our community, which is zoned for commercial development, which means if we are to do these projects, they are largely falling on the residential property owners. So we have the tension of urgency of some of those building projects, which we'll hear more about when the study is complete, bumping up against the longer time horizon to develop any new and meaningful incremental commercial tax base. This is why the Select Board has asked us to look into alternatives that might provide a source of funds for large-scale capital projects. Several communities across the Commonwealth have instituted a property transfer fee of up to 2% on the sale of a property. The sole purpose of today's discussion is to identify the types of research that we would like to engage in as a committee to properly vet this concept in order to make a recommendation to the Select Board at one of their future meetings. So I'm going to begin with a couple of work streams and questions that come to mind for me, and then I'd like to solicit and open it up to input to the group for additional thoughts. So I'd like to start with, researching and gathering a list of all the communities that have considered such a transfer fee. And when we do that, we should be looking at where has it been adopted successfully, and are there any specific earmarks that the money is allocated to? And then correspondingly, where has such consideration not passed? And when it was defeated, what were the most important questions that failed to be addressed? So that's one sort of research stream in my mind. A second would be, and so what has the impact been? Where it has been adopted, are there any change in home sale rates or price appreciation relative to peer communities? Because I would imagine that would be one potential objection, that it would be something that while being borne by the purchaser, it really ends up affecting home prices. And then secondly, where it has been adopted, what, if any, projects has it been able to fund? So that's a second work stream. A third would be one where if we did sort of a backcast, if you will, if we look back at a 5 to 10 year period of home sales in Westwood, and we said, what are the total number of units and what's the total dollar sales? And we said, for a ballpark, let's use a 1% number. What would that have accrued to be in terms of a potential capital fund? And then lastly, and this one I think, Stephanie, is probably a work stream for you, is what are the accounting procedures that must be followed? And does that need to be counted as revenue and budgeted and spent each year? Or can we accrue it for larger scale project needs? So those are the sort of work streams that I have in mind as I think about this. As you all think about the prospect of such and what you would want to know and what you'd want to be able to answer for other residents, are there things that come to mind as additional work streams or additional pieces of information that you'd like to know? And by all means, feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you as those come up.
Rob? Oh,
Yeah,
Julie
I
had her
see
hand up.
Julie
Yep.
Bride has a question.
Quick question. So you started this by saying, the limitations of 2.5, et cetera. And it feels like, with the new increase in taxes that residents are feeling a little fatigued, which is cost in this economic climate. So is the intent to find additional revenue from residential or commercial? Is
So-
this only it's only home sales, or is it commercial sales too?
I think that's a great thing to research. How has that been applied? Has it been applied
Yeah.
to only residential or residential and commercial? So to sort of take that question, because there's like two parts to it, right?
Yeah.
I agree with you that there is exhaustion on the taxation front, and that is partially due to the fact that while we expected taxes to go up by about 8% when we voted the new school, because of the difference in the tax shift factor and real estate growing much slower than residential, the reality was taxes went up by about 12%. So I fully understand that. And that's why the Select Board has asked us to look at well, what are some other ways that we might be able to develop revenue streams and ones that would manifest quickly? And so this
Yeah.
would be one that sort of falls into that category. But I think understanding whether or not that applies to residential only or residential and commercial is a good add to our list of research. So thank you.
And can I just add one more thing to consider? And this is a detail, but if I was selling in Westwood and moving to another property, am I paying that twice? Like, what are some of the details around how it would actually work?
So,
Yeah.
and again, I think this is part of what we will research in terms of the mechanics, but my expectation is that this would be a cost borne by the purchaser of the home.
Okay,
Right? So if you were selling and you were moving to a community that didn't have this, you wouldn't pay anything. If you were moving to a community that did have a similar type of thing, I think what you would pay would be dependent on what percentage they set that at. So I can't speak to the specifics of it, but conceptually, what I see is it is something that is borne by the purchaser.
okay, thanks.
Nancy Hyde, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm not even sure the way it plays out in different communities, if it's always the purchaser. I think that's sometimes the case. I think there are maybe exceptions where it's shared by seller and buyer. So
Okay.
that's part of the research. 2 points, I was going to say, we should look at our adoption of the meals and hotel tax, because that too was something we added where it was transactional as opposed to a change in real estate taxes. So the transaction, meaning anybody who stays at the hotel or anybody who dines in the community, could be, mostly people outside of Westwood, are contributing to our revenue generation. And so I think looking at that, what we've been able to do with it might just be information.
And that's a great point too. In one of the questions that I mentioned earlier, Steph, we don't have to spend that every year, right? We can accrue
Yeah, we can
that and
accumulate
do
it.
that. Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah, so that was one point. And the other, Julie kind of touched on it. And representing the Board of Assessors, we can certainly work to get the historic information of sales. But I dabbled in looking at 2023. We don't have a lot of commercial transactions in town. That's obvious because we don't have a lot of commercial property in town. So for them to actually sell is something else altogether. So I think we have to look at that separately from the residential. It doesn't happen predictably. It doesn't happen frequently, but when it happens, it's much larger
Yeah.
in a single transaction. So, or generally could be much larger in a single transaction. So it's just, that's an area where we should do a dive.
And actually you raised something that, where you say it's not reliable in terms of predictable. I think if anything were to be adopted, a recommendation should come along that, we never in any fiscal year spend down more than X percent of that, because you don't
policy.
know what the next year is going to be.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions from you, Nancy? Okay. Paul, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, so I'm wondering, I know you mentioned that towns across the Commonwealth have done this. Do you know which towns near us have done it? I have a couple questions, but that would be my first.
So I don't know
Which
enough about the communities that have either looked at it or eventually adopted it. So that to me is one of the streams that we should be exploring. I know that, for example, Martha's Vineyard has done it. And in some communities, from what my cursory research has been, is that oftentimes they allocate it for development of housing. So, but again, those are all of the types of considerations that I would want us to vet and understand, because I view this as a sort of similar to hotels and meals tax, something that we use for one-time capital needs. And in my mind, this would be one that we would use for larger capital needs, not sort of ongoing capital needs, but big projects like school buildings and municipal buildings.
And I'm assuming that, because we're in the research stage, that people shouldn't we're not saying we're doing this. We're going to do a lot of vetting before we do it.
I mean, to me, the reason this group exists is to
Yeah.
be able to have discussions and more in-depth discussions on things like that so that we can properly explore alternatives.
So on that note, alternatives, there are other ways to generate revenue. And I know we sort of missed the boat on Community Preservation Act. And, many towns adopted that long ago. I know we've revisited it a few years ago, but things like that or other things, are we looking at those as well?
Well, this group looked at the CPA last year.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm just
Yeah.
saying, but there are other things as well. So what,
If- Yeah, if there are other things that come to mind that you think this group ought to explore, let's talk about some of those
Yeah.
things. And they are, worth having discussions about.
right. Yeah, I mean, I came at the end of this. I came after they had made that decision about CPA and, I don't know that I would have changed anybody's mind. It's just one of those things, the best time to
I
plant a
think one of the
tree is.
things that well, I think one of the things that this is relative to CPA sort of requires 4 buckets, and one of the things that, from how you utilize those, and this is sort of outside of any of those 4, but is to our collective benefit as a community. So I think it's similar in some ways, but different in terms of the flavor, and it may give us greater flexibility on how we use those funds in what our needs are projected to be long term. But
No,
if there are other things that you think that we should be considering from a revenue generation standpoint, I'm all ears. Now,
yeah, no, listen, I get that we have a lot of capital projects. I've been here a long time. I chaired many an override, but, I do worry, given, especially if this burden goes on purchasers, the people are spending ridiculous amounts of money on interest and, on housing. It's much different. A lot of young people trying to move back to town aren't able to do it. There's a lot going on. So I'm just
all things that are worthy of discussion as
Yeah.
we gather facts. Absolutely. Now, Phil, I see you have your hand up. Pat, Paula, any other points to make?
No,
or any
that's-
other
I
research
just
that you'd
wanted
like
to-
us to do?
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Phil, I see you have your hand up, but I see Pat also has his hand up and Stephanie does. I don't know if any of your hand raise is in response to a question that was already asked. So I'll turn to Pat first.
So I did a little legislative research, and it's far from exhaustive, but there appears to be some 13 home rule petitions to allow transfer taxes. Virtually all of them have almost all of them have a housing piece. Truro has 50% to the capital stabilization fund and 50% housing. Provincetown, it's all to the general fund. There appears to be 5 general bills from various legislators that tend to be mostly for affordable housing. And there's one other thing that I saw, but I didn't write down where. There's a town seeking a home rule petition to allow a surcharge on fuel sold within its town, like a nickel per gallon. So that was another alternative I just wanted to put out in front of the group if you wanted to look at it.
Okay. Yep, to Paula's point. Steph, did you have something that was thank you, Pat. Anything further to add before I go to Steph?
Sorry. Pat, anything? I was pretty much, Pat and I sort of were researching together, so I was gonna say something very similar.
Okay.
He kind of touched on it, and I believe there are about 18 communities so far that have successfully passed a home rule petition in Massachusetts. And I just wanted to point out something when Paula brought up CPA, I just sort of, for a reference point, wanted to distinguish between sort of the 2 paths of those things. So it's CPA that's established in Massachusetts, and local governments have the option to adopt that as a local option, it's called. This has not, and please Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, I couldn't find anything that shows that this has been sort of adopted at the state level yet. So if the community were to go forward with this, we would follow the similar path of every other community in Massachusetts so far, which would mean special legislation. So it would be a home rule petition. So it's just a little bit more detailed than sort of say the CPA, but along those lines, if it is special legislation, we have the option of sort of forming it. Like Pat was saying, some communities have, a lot of it is towards housing, but some have sort of specified, is it on the seller, is it on the buyer? What's the percentage? It's
Yep.
sort of more customizable because it would be our special legislation. So I just
And-
wanted to throw those things out.
Sure, and I think, you know, when we do the exhaustive research on it, then we sort of lay it out and present it so that everybody has that same information. Phil, I know you had your hand up. I'm sorry.
No problem. So I had a few things. One is, I assume we're going into this with a sort of an open slate about whether it's 1% or 2% or whatever. And also, you know, when it was proposed for the city of Boston, I believe there was a limit, so it only applied to properties over a certain amount. I can't remember if it was $1 million or $1.5 million or whatever. But you know, I think that should be on the table as well. If we're worried about affordability, then maybe we just say, yeah, it's on properties over $2 million.
I would actually, I like where you're going in terms of making sure that we vet all options, and sort of similar to what Julie was asking about commercial residential. You know, another way to maybe address that could be, and Stephanie, this might be one that you and Pat take on in terms of viability. Could we have some percentage or some make it allowable for this to be a source of funds for, say, our Aid to the Elderly program, to provide some senior tax relief? And then conversely, to talk about some of what Paula just said, could we have a first-time home buyer credit of some sort, where, you know, instead of it being, let's make believe for a moment that, you know, we came up with a 1% surcharge. Maybe it gives you a 1/4 point or 1/2 point off, so that as a first-time home buyer, you are not as burdened by that. So a couple different, Phil, thank you for raising that as another thing for us to research.
And one other thing that sort of goes on in the back of my mind, and Chris and I had a discussion about this earlier in the summer, under Prop 2.5. So one of the things we have to keep in mind is, at the margin, this would only affect overrides. We're going to be doing the full 2.5% every year, because if we don't do that, we lose it. So people's taxes would have still gone up 12%, even if we had this, because we're going to go up by 2.5%. And if residential property values go up more quickly than commercial, and we don't change the
Yes, but let's double click into that a little bit further. So yes, it would have gone up by 2.5% plus whatever new growth is. Typically, we budget around 0.5%. So there's 3. When we voted the Pine Hill, that equated to an additional 5% in that first year's tax bill, right? That incremental 4% that got us to 12 was due to that residential commercial tax shift. So if we were to have had this fund, this capital fund that could have paid the debt service on the Pine Hill, for example, instead of your taxes going up by that 5% that the school component made up, let's assume for a minute we had built this fund to where it would have been able to handle the debt service for the school, your taxes would have gone up by 7%, not the full 12.
right. So avoiding the capital costs or the override would affect tax rates, but the core 2.5% and whatever shift is because I don't know exactly where we are, but I assume we're in the high 160s or 170 is the tax shift. So we don't have a hell of a lot of room to go.
We actually went to 1.72 this past year, right, Steph? And so we only have, it caps
Yeah.
out at 1.75, as you know, Phil. So,
Yeah.
So we don't have a lot of
Yeah.
relief valve to apply. And the other thing is we need to maintain a reasonable commercial tax base to maintain that split tax rate. So,
Right. So I just think, should we go forward with something or, present something on this? I think we have to be very careful. And I think the subtleties of 2.5 and, what this would have, one of the frustrations I hear at town meeting every year and occasionally outside of town meeting is, we've got Westwood Station, we've got, hotel tax, meals tax, we've got all this other stuff that we're doing. We're doing all the right things and my taxes still went up dramatically, So, I think there is, there's some concern, frustration out there on that. And, maybe at some point in the distant future, after we build up, were we to build up huge amounts of reserves from this, we might be able to mitigate some future over 2.5 increases, but these increases are pretty much baked in for the foreseeable future. And, we're a high tax town now.
short of cutting services, that is 100% true, right? We, as we're probably 80% people in terms of what the budget is, and 2/3 of that is likely covered each year before we even begin a budget discussion because it's all subject to collective bargaining. So
Yeah.
your point is well taken. And one of the reasons that I love this group is we have a bunch of really smart people who are willing to speak up and have, to vet things and have some good discussion around things. So thank you for raising those, Phil, and we will be mindful of those as we go forward. Julie, I see you have your hand up. Do you have another question?
Yeah, so, so you mentioned a couple of the towns that have done this and they feel like towns where people are buying second homes or areas where investment property. So a little bit different maybe than our town. And I don't want to solve for that, but it makes me think, by way of background, have we looked at what other like towns have done to increase revenue in towns? Like, was there a step prior to?
Different work stream if you like, so
Well,
sort of similar to Paula's question. And
Yeah,
I think Pat mentioned the fuel surcharge of some sort. So,
Yeah.
If there are other options that other communities have utilized creatively to generate incremental revenue, I think those are things that are worthwhile of exploring. And that's also, to that list of the communities. I don't know if all of them are communities where they're sort of second home type of things, or
Yeah.
whether or not it's, that's part of why I want to hear the whole list, not only of those who have implemented, but those who've actually explored it and where it didn't move forward.
Yeah,
Because
no, I
want-
agree.
Yeah.
I think that's critical.
Yep.
Yep. Thanks, Rob.
Sure thing. Nancy James, I see you have your hands up.
So would it make sense to do something in parallel? So maybe look at the towns that explored or implemented this transfer tax, but then also look at just some towns with a similar structure to Westwood with limited commercial base, and see what they've done to, to your point, what they've been creative with in terms of looking for solutions. So maybe have two paths. So it's not just we look at this transfer fee and leave it there. So maybe explore other options at the same time.
So let me put some of that to Stephanie to ask the question, how easy would it be to come up with a cohort of communities that have similar split tax rates and similar constraints in terms of the amount of land that is developable as commercial tax make? I am just curious as to, how challenging that research might be. I know we have our comprehensive plan that lays out some of the land use and things like that. So that would be a source document that would be fairly easy if someone were researching Westwood. I just don't know how easy that might be to do. Not saying it's just because it's hard, Nancy, that it's not worth doing. I like the idea, because then if you've got a really good cohort, right, we've got something to compare to. So Steph, can I put you on the spot and ask you some questions on that?
Sure. What are the questions?
So the question is, how challenging would it be to come up with a list of like communities, call it size, tax structure, and what I'll call constraints, where you look at what percent of their land and or tax base is commercial, right? So like Dover is often a community that we compare ourselves to in a lot of ways, but they don't have a split tax rate, right? So, they may be worth looking at because they don't have that split tax rate, but they may also, they're not sort of dealing with a shrinking as a percent of the pie commercial tax base, which is creating some of the shift that Phil was alluding to earlier. So I think that Nancy's question around having a good comparable set of communities and looking at maybe some of the things they have done to explore alternative revenue streams would be helpful. So I'm just curious as to how hard you think it would be to come up with that list of communities.
The list of communities that are like Westwood, or the list of communities and then also what they've done for alternative revenue sources?
So let's take it in two parts, right? So let's start with the list of communities. Split
Yeah,
tax
that should
rate.
be pretty okay to come up with. That's not a big lift. Yep.
So starting with, it's got split tax rate, what percent of their tax base is commercial, and what percent of their land is zone commercial? Because to me, that percent of land that is zone commercial is one of the challenges that we face, right? Because that's what makes the new development aspect of anything that we do from a new growth a much longer term issue, because one, it might require zoning. Two, it requires current business owners to be willing to sell. Three, it requires a developer willing to take the time to consolidate, properties to be able to put together a viable project. And then what's the actual incremental yield on that? Because we already have a commercial tax base in those things that would get redeveloped. So those are things that I look at and I say, okay, I'd like to understand communities with split tax rate, communities of those, what percent is commercial tax base, and then of those same communities, what percent of their land is zone commercial.
So what I would see myself doing is, coming up with a list of say 20 communities that I could think of, and then sending out a sort of survey, right? Like sending out emails to those towns, asking those exact questions, getting the data back, and putting it all together. So it shouldn't be a big lift. Is it sort of in relation to what we're looking at with this real estate transfer fee and sort of trying to figure out communities like us that have done this, or is it outside of that?
Ask, I guess, two things. One is, have they ever considered it? And if so, was it implemented? And maybe a third piece is, are there any earmarks related to it? If that's an easy survey for you to do of peers, then that would be wonderful.
I can definitely take that on. Yep. Happy to.
Did I miss anything, Nancy, in terms of the types of things that you were looking to, tease out?
No, I think that covers it. I Thank you.
Excellent. Paul, I see you have your hand up again.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I mean,
Hello, no.
what else
I
you got?
wanted to jump in on a couple things. First of all, we did a similar thing. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the community chest, the community chest is a group in Westwood that helps people who are in financial need. We give a lot of money out every year. Much of it comes from people who have been in town for a long time and are feeling the pinch from taxes it's seniors. And shout out to Pat, because years ago when Pat was in your seat, Rob, I think Pat, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you started the senior, the aid to the elderly, and I think we all appreciate that. And when we look at those creative ways to find an answer, whether it's seniors working, in town at jobs and working off some of their tax stuff. I mean, I think if we do something like this, we have really got to think about the other things that Westwood does in terms of helping residents, so that people understand that as these taxes, whether it's this tax transfer, which if we did it to sellers or whatever, would certainly be an issue. But, what else is available out there? But when getting to the point of other towns, we actually did a survey to other towns to see who else was doing things like the community chest, because when we started it wasn't really a thing.
Mhm.
And I would imagine that that's probably a lot of the same towns, because they're feeling the same squeeze. So I'm happy to share
So as
some
a,
of that.
sure. And then as a follow-up, maybe that could be one other question. Stephanie, in your survey is, what type of senior tax relief options are there in those communities? Chris Coleman, I see you have your hand up. Paula, were you done? I'm sorry, before I go to Chris.
I'm done. Yeah, sorry. I won't say another word.
No. Chris, please.
Thank you. And just as a quick Google search, I think in September of 23, there were 110 communities in Massachusetts. So that's 110 out of 351 that had split tax rates. So when you're looking at the split tax rates, just to let you know, your pool of communities is going to go down by 2/3.
Sure. Yep.
So just to make sure everyone's aware of that.
Okay. Any other thoughts on additional? This has been fantastic discussion in terms of the type of things that I think, in order for us to properly vet this as a group, that we should do. So any other thoughts on work streams? All right. If no, then there's the next question, the old adage, many hands make light work. I'd love to get one person who is willing to take each of these specific work stream and sort of volunteer to do some of that research. Do I have anybody who, so Stephanie, I think I've got the one that sort of falls clearly in your lane. Is there anyone else willing to step up and do some of the other work stream? Nancy Hyde.
I'll work with Stephanie on getting the history of sales and any information that we can get that can give us quantitative information.
That
as
makes
it
sense, as our
applies and-
representative from the Board of Assessors.
Assessors.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay.
I said I wouldn't talk again, but I'm here for the work. So Rob, my skill set. Let me know what you need.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, Paula. And anyone else feel like taking on any particular aspect of this?
So Rob, I don't know if it's still up, but Ellen Rollins has her hand up. I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ellen, by all means.
Hi, thank you, Chris. Yes, I'm happy to work on any part of this research that you think is necessary. Obviously, zoning and that kind of land use stuff is kind of my wheelhouse, but I'm happy to look at anything that you need.
I'll tell you what I think makes sense is let's start with, since some of the information that we've talked about may well come out of what Stephanie gets in her initial survey of peers. So we've got Nancy taking the look at sort of the historical home sales. And then once we have a list from Stephanie of sort of those peer communities, then I think we can look at, one person takes what impact has it had? Has there been any change in home sales rates or price appreciation relative to some of the surrounding communities where it was implemented? And then, maybe we split the first part where we talked about, where has it, because we'll have the list of where it has been successfully adopted, but maybe we look a little more deeply into where it has been failed to be implemented, and what were some of the questions that were not adequately addressed, or what were some of the concerns that the community had. So I think let's start, maybe Stephanie, with your research, your survey, and then we can get Paula and Ellen a piece of whatever the follow-up is. Stephanie, I see you have your hand up. Oh, I got a bunch of hands now. This is great.
I will say so the research I'm doing, you asked me to look at comparable communities, right? I think you should also have someone researching what communities have already adopted this and sort of what exemptions they've put in place, because what the communities I'm going to be polling are not going to be the ones that have implemented this so far. I have a list already, and I know someone will, but it's Boston, Brookline, Edgartown, Nantucket, Oak Bluffs, Provincetown, Somerville. These are not our comparable communities. So while I do my research, it'll be completely different. Someone researching sort of who's implemented it already, how successful it was, why they did it, where the funds are going. So I do think it would be important for someone to be researching that as well in the meantime, and sort of what the exemptions have been in each community and how they implemented it, what the rules around it are.
Very good. Well, thank you. Great point. So I think Julie still has her hand up, but I saw Nancy and Paul. I saw Nancy's hand first. So Nancy, did you have something that you wanted to say? And then I'll go to Paul, and then I'll go to Julie.
So I just wanted to say that I'll help out with, whatever's needed in that next phase once we sort of come up with that list.
Very good. Okay. Paul, thank you.
Yeah, I'm also, Paula, if you're looking for some help, I'd love to work with you as far as any assistance you need. So just join me on this one. And I do want to say out to everybody, I think it seems like we're all on the same page of looking out for our residents and making sure that is the first thing that we have to think of. I know there's a lot of, just to reiterate what's being said, there is a lot of conversation around town about what our expenses are and what's going on with taxes and all that sort of fun stuff. So we, again, just everybody said it. Heard Julianne in the beginning, heard Nancy say it, Paula as well. Everybody, I think we're all on the same page that we have to do our best as a group to try and lessen the burden and keep the pain off of our residents and kind of find a way of dispersing it. And how we do it, Rob, I don't know. We'll have to look to your leadership to figure out what the heck we're going to do here. But I think it's something that we're all on the same page. That's what we need to do.
Thank you, Paul. I couldn't agree more. And that's what I love about this group of people is, you're not willing to shy away from something because it's the right thing to explore and have a perspective on, right? We can't make a decision without actually having the facts around which to make a well-informed decision. So thank you. Julie.
Can you remind me or help me understand with our existing commercial tax base, like when you talk about, meals tax and stuff, are there certain industries that generate more revenue for us? So should we be thinking, or has there ever been thought about giving advantages to, restaurants or certain things that we not only get the tax on the rent or whatever, but whatever that business sells? Am I making sense? Like,
Well, and I'm going to take my first stab, and then I'm going to ask Nora and Stephanie to keep me honest on this. Okay. So with respect to, the commercial tax base itself, that is a function of the value of the land, the improvements made to the land, the personal property inside of that business, and what the property sells for, that are all, or what it's assessed at, essentially, sorry. That factor into those things. So while hotels and meals, hotels probably are some of the highest overall yielding properties for us because they tend to be large. There's a fair bit of personal property within them. And so they're assessed at sort of a higher value. And you have then the hotel's tax piece of it.
Right.
There's a balance of what that sort of, the need in the community is and what the occupancy rates are for whether or not somebody's going to come and put a hotel in. On the restaurant side, tend to be smaller in footprint. Yes, there is some equipment in it. So they do provide the meals tax. So, what we do, and this is, just for the community's sake, when we look at the total pie, and let's just say it's $100, just to keep the math simple. If the commercial tax base represents 15% of the assessed value and homes represent 85% of the assessed value, we can, as the select board at our discretion, have a tax shift factor where we shift some of that burden from residents onto the commercial properties. And so oftentimes what that ends up being is, excuse me on that phone ringing, is it probably shifts things to sort of let's call it 78-22%. So there is some tax relief that is provided to the residents, but as Phil alluded to earlier, in this past year where residential growth was 3 times the rate of commercial growth, that changed that percentage of the pie, and residential ended up picking up more than what commercial did, even with an increased tax shift factor, right? We went from 1.7 to 1.72, and even doing that, it didn't keep pace with the shift in the pie. So does that answer your question, Julie?
It does, but I'm also thinking about kind of building upon Paul's points. People love the Islington side and the development. We look at 109 and see a lot of banks, realtors, orthodontists, that are handy, but not really making a community like a Needham that has retail, and restaurants and usable. So is there any point of alignment here where we can do more to increase usefulness for residents and also increase some revenue? And what levers do we have to pull as a town to make those things happen? Do you know what I mean?
So yeah, I want to sort of answer that and then bring Nora in to talk about that. I mean, some of that, quite frankly, is dependent on the current property owners for those commercially owned areas, right? They may have existing tenants that they're not willing to end the relationship on the prospect of bringing someone else in, especially where, if you're a bank or an orthodontist, that's a pretty stable source of rent because they're going to be less, for example, impacted by a pandemic.
Right,
So,
right.
there
I
are,
agree. I
Yeah.
just wonder if there's ways to apply some form of tax to maybe those businesses, or I don't
Sure.
know. I shouldn't be solutioning, but I just, kind of hearing what our neighbors and people are saying.
sensitive to it. And Nora, by all means, please, elaborate on anything that I've said here. And if I've misspoken, feel free to correct me.
Sure. So I think one of the differences, just comparing Islington Center to High Street, is the density of residential development. We saw Islington looking very much like High Street prior to a change in zoning that allowed for multifamily residential development. And I think that is the key factor in what's changed the nature of one village over the other. So if we eventually see multifamily housing development in the High Street area, I think that the more active retail restaurant uses will follow. It's zoned for that right now, but the property owners have not expressed interest. So we are limited in what we can do there. As far as there was a question earlier about what type of commercial use generates the most in tax dollars.
Yeah.
It really varies because our buildings are taxed on an income basis. So you'll have a building like the Meditech building at 100, 200 University is probably one of our very highest tax properties in town. You also have an industrial complex at 26 Dartmouth Street. That's the new 24M complex that's under development. That's also very high. We have the Citizens Bank building on Station Drive, takes in currently with a TIF in place, a tax increment financing program in place, it already takes in over $20 million. So while we have hotels that we have one hotel right now, and we have a prospect for another who's looking for a TIF before they're interested in going forward. But a hotel, we get the additional generation of the hotel tax on top of the property tax. Property tax is not all that high. That's probably in the area of $7 million right now for the courtyard. So just for comparison, it all has to do with how new the building is, how high the finishes are, and more importantly, what the income stream for that building is. We do try to attract restaurants whenever possible, because a restaurant and a retail space, you know, if you compare them, we definitely get more revenue from the
So
restaurant.
I just want to make one clarification for anyone who might be listening now or at some future point in a recording. When you say Citizens is 20 million, it's not 20 million in tax revenue to the town, it's 20 million in revenue upon which the
Yes.
tax is
Yeah.
paid.
Yes, sorry about that.
Good
So right, I'm not-
clarification.
yes, I'm
I
not
got it,
comparing.
but. And
I'm
do we
not
tax-
speaking to the tax dollars, I'm speaking to the assessments, correct?
Thanks, Nora. One quick question. Do we tax rental properties or if they're Airbnbs in town?
We do not have a short-term rental law in place that imposes any restrictions. So they would be taxed as a single-family commercial home or two-family, whatever the case may be.
They've been doing that down the Cape and stuff too. We might hear some of that in some of the research.
Yep.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Okay, I know we are coming up on the 9 o'clock hour. I have a couple of people who have texted me saying that they may need to drop. I saw two other hands raised. I believe I saw Nancy and Paul. Is that right? Do either of you have additional comments, questions? Paul, I think you're talking. Were you on mute?
Sorry, I've got two monitors and sometimes I just can't find that mouse. But yeah, I mean, it was just a comment, you know, something like what we've done over in Islington, you know, where we have the retail space below, you know, the units. I mean, this is a common practice now that's going on in the city everywhere. Somerville obviously is one of the largest communities doing that right now, and I don't know if there's any requirement for us to do that. And that's just something for us to think about. You know, if you're going to build something, if you're going to do some rental properties, then your requirement is you have to put in some retail space where we can have continued access to the taxes coming in from those businesses doing retails. So just something to think about as well.
Yep, and I think that, you know, both Nora and Ellen can speak to the fact that, you know, where we have expanded some of these mixed use zones, that's essentially the intent there as well, you know, to be able to open those opportunities up.
Yeah, and are we mandating that? Are we like giving them the option, or are we mandating that? I'd like, you know, maybe we take a different approach. We mandate saying this is what you have to do. You have to give back to the community. This is what you're doing, as opposed to, hey, we'd like you to do this. Let us take that. You know, again, are we in that position? Is this what the purpose of the of this team? I don't know. You know, the unfamiliarity of what direction we need to head in.
Thank you.
If could I just respond to that? So we have flexible multiple use zoning in different areas throughout the town, and that does require a commercial first floor use with residential above. We have a new zoning, the Mumford zone that was enacted as part of the MBTA community law. And in certain areas, that zoning does not have a commercial component. It has a commercial allowance, and a developer who was looking for more residential development would be required to have a commercial component to their building, but it's not required everywhere. On High Street and on Washington Street, we have flexible multiple use zones that apply, and those do require commercial on the first floor.
Excellent.
Stephanie.
I just want to make sure we sort of, before we wrap up, that we sort of have clear assignments and a goal of what we want to accomplish and sort of a timeline for it. So I don't know if anyone, have we really assigned much? Is anyone clear on what?
So I think you're gonna do your survey. I'm going to, take a look at different, we've got several volunteers here. I'm gonna consider, different folks and, I know Ellen put her hand up to do some stuff, and I think that there is probably some things that may line up. But I'm also very cognizant of the amount of time that she already gives to the town. So I want to take a look at what we have and how we might break it off into bite-sized pieces, because we've had so many people raise their hand. So I think we can circle back on that. Last couple pieces of business. Knowing that we're going to be getting results back from both the facility study and from all of our research on this topic, Laura, I'd like you to put out some type of poll to get meetings on the calendar for October, November, and December, because I do think we will have some meat to talk about. Obviously, we haven't met for the past 6 months because we have had less substance to discuss. I think we will have more substance to discuss in the fourth quarter. So if you could do that, I'd appreciate it. Lastly, we have minutes to approve from our January 24th meeting. Did everyone have a chance to review those? If so, can I get, and if there are no changes, can I get a motion to approve those?
So moved.
So moved.
Excellent. Can I get a second?
Second.
All right. Just going to go through real quick, do a roll call vote to get approval on those. Nancy Hyde, you still with us?
I think it's off, Nancy.
Oh, she dropped. Okay. Ellen.
I have to abstain.
Okay. Matt is not here. Phil.
Yes.
Paul.
Approved.
Julie.
Yes.
Nancy James.
Yes.
Paula.
Yes.
And I am a yes as well. So they are approved. With that, I appreciate all of you dedicating time to some really robust discussion this morning. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn?
Second.
All right. Going to do the roll call. Before I do, thank you all. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of your summer. Real quick, don't jump off yet. Ellen, motion to adjourn.
Aye.
Phil.
Yes.
Paul.
Yes.
Julie.
Yes.
Nancy.
Yes.
Paula.
Yes.
And I am a yes as well. We are adjourned. Thank you all. Have a great summer, and we will be back in touch with potential dates for Q4 and follow-up work streams.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks, Rob.